Hello everyone. Testing. Welcome. Alright, let's start. Let's jump right in. Okay, thanks so much for joining everybody. Really appreciate it. This is my first live, so wish me luck. And let's jump right in. I know, people usually like to hear a lot of actionable tips, so I really want to jump right in and get ready. Okay, so tonight's topic is about understanding anxiety and learning practical and actionable tips to help you deal with it. So just the word anxiety, again, it has so much power, but what is it and what can you do about it? So I always like to start off by defining it. It's always interesting how you hear people say what actually is anxiety, even if you ask therapists, and people just don't know. People actually, say, I don't know, it's a feeling. What is anxiety? How would you define it? Because I feel like the more you know about something, the more understanding you have of it, the better it is and the easier it is to deal with it. So here's the thing. So anxiety, I define as an overreaction to a perceived threat. So it is an overreaction, but it's to a perceived threat because, it seems like a threat and we feel like it's a threat, which we'll get into. Our body reacts as such, so on and so forth, fight and flight. But, it's usually not something which is a danger, which is a catastrophe. So that's right off the bat a really, really nice definition to have. What really is it though? So of course anxiety could be thoughts. It could be the way we feel. It can feel our body. There's so many ways it affects us, but what really is it's our thoughts and the way we feel in our body. So just as a nice, operational definition. That's number one. Now, with all of that, how do you deal with it? Once you're able to identify it. So the first step is to identify it. Anytime you have something on, you feel stressed, you feel anxious, you feel overwhelmed, there's so much going on, right? It's so hard to deal with, feel waves of panic overtaking us. The first step to do is to always to try to identify how you feel. So in this case, we're going to assume that you feel anxious. So that means you're able to accurately identify that indeed is how you're feeling. Ideally in a mindful way. So I'm going to discuss a lot about mindfulness. I don't want this to turn into a mindfulness talk. I feel like that could be a separate talk. But anytime I use the word mindfulness, for the sake of tonight's talk, it just means in a calm, factual way, an effective way, in a curious way. That's what I mean by mindfulness. So try to mindfully notice that you're anxious. That's right off the bat, number one. Step number two is to validate it. Super important. Validate it means that it makes sense that you feel this way. You're not crazy. The emotion's there. The emotion's real. You really do feel anxious. So that's always what you want to do. Now, once you've done that, hopefully you're a little bit more calm, then you can move on to say, all right, can I do anything about it? Which ideally, yes, I think there's tons that you can do about it once you know it. So please pay attention, take notes, and once we start, we are not slowing down. Okay, so what can you do when you're feeling anxious? So the first thing is to ask yourself, is there a reason why I'm feeling anxious? Because most of the time there is. You're probably thinking about something, you're worried about something, you might be engaging what ifs, what if this happens, what if that happens, you might be overwhelmed, you're thinking about 2, 3, 4 things at once, so no wonder why you're stressed. So most of the time, it really is something specific. So if you can sort of identify, hey, what's going on right now? What caused this emotion to sort of overtake me? That's always great. So a little about CBT. I don't want to get too much into whole CBT now. It's hard to teach it all just in a minute. But basically the way CBT works is the thoughts that a person has affects their emotion, which in turn affects their behavior. So over here, assuming that you do have an anxious thought, it is going to affect your emotion and you're going to feel more anxious, which in turn is going to affect your behavior, which means you're going to act anxious. So one great tool of dealing with your anxious thoughts when you're feeling anxious is, to identify the thought, right? And just to be clear, what's the difference between a thought and an emotion, right? People mix them up all the time, and that's another reason why it's so hard to do anything about it. It's because are you trying to tackle, what you're thinking about, which is often the case, or how you're feeling. right? Your emotion. So an emotion is usually one word, like I feel frustrated, embarrassed, anxious, happy, sad. A thought is a sentence. So, hey, I wonder what's going to happen over Yom Tov with my mother-in-law, with my father-in-law. What's going to happen with my boss tomorrow? Those are all examples of anxious thoughts. So if it is indeed a thought, so step number one would be to try to use things like logic to reframe the thought. What would be an example of an anxious thought? So we gave a couple. I don't know what's going to happen. I know I'm going to have a terrible day. How am I going to deal with my boss? Social anxiety, dating anxiety. It's just all different examples of those anxious thoughts. So try to reframe it. So reframe it means see, is the thought accurate? If your thought is, I know I'm going to mess up, ask yourself, wait, what's the evidence that I'm actually going to mess up? Have I done this before? How does it usually go? And the answer is, it usually goes pretty good. Certainly not a disaster. So basically, another way of saying that is using logic, reframing the thought. So that would be a really, really good step one, would be to reframe your thought. Okay? Step number two would be as far as, focus also on your body. What if your body's anxious? What if you're too anxious even to, pay attention to your thoughts, which often does happen, so then you can use something, distract. Let's say your anxiety level is, from 0 to 100, it's like an 80, it's a 90, it's a 95. So in that case, we don't really have that cognitive thing going on. It's hard to think. So then you can use a distract technique, which is really like a temporary measure just to sort of bring yourself down a bit. So examples of distract would be, you can breathe, you could do relaxed or paced or paired breathing. Another really great way to distract and to bring the anxiety level down, even a tiny bit. And this is really a DBT skill of distract. It's a great way to deal with a really high emotion, for instance, anxiety. It's when we change our body's temperature. So when we want to change our body's temperature, our body's parasympathetic system, for instance, splashing your face with freezing cold water, an ice cube you can use, exercise, push-ups, you can run outside for a jog. All of those would be great examples of actually changing your body's temperature. And number one, it stops the anxiety from getting worse, which is, of course, not great. Number two, it actually maybe can bring it down a bit. Once you do that, then you can use more cognitive skills, which we'll get to a couple more in a second, and that will be more realistic. Okay? Once we're on the subject of emotions were really high, which probably a lot of people watching this can relate, and really who can't relate? Everyone has high emotions sometimes. Anxiety is so common. So another great one to do is basically, we discussed a lot as far as if your anxiety is, like anxious thoughts, and if you're able to problem solve and able to reframe your thought, sometimes there is unexplained anxiety. So you do a check-in, and you don't know why you're anxious. You just feel so anxious. It's hard to deal with, and you're certainly not doing much thinking. So a really great technique to use, also, which is the DBT technique, dialectical behavior therapy, is called opposite emotion. So in other words, you ask yourself, is it effective to give into this emotion or not, right? And the answer is, of course not, right? Anxiety is probably telling you, stay put, don't take risks, don't get out of bed, don't go to work tomorrow, I can't deal with this. So do a really quick check-in and ask yourself, should I listen to this or not? And if you don't even know why you're anxious, if it's an unexplained sort of anxiety, which can happen, you just feel a pit in your stomach, you're just nervous, scared, you feel off. So it's basically like, okay, well, what should I do? What behavior should I do? And very often it's doing completely opposite, and just go the same opposite your emotion. So if your anxiety is telling you stay in the house, you're probably better off leaving the house. Very similar, for instance, if you'd be depressed, if your depression says it's so hard, it's hopeless, so opposite emotion would be, let me go completely opposite and jump out of bed or do something. That's a really terrific way to deal with your anxiety and to use that opposite emotion technique. Okay, I just want to do a quick check-in to make sure we're good, and so on and so forth. Okay. Fantastic. Thanks again, everyone. Okay, so that's as far as dealing with the opposite emotion. Hopefully at that point you are a little bit more calm and rational. And then you could get back to your cognitive. Because again, most of the time there is a reason why it's a hard situation and why you're anxious, okay? Another really, really good one is called check the facts. So check the facts means, hey, my anxiety is telling me, that this is really tough. Like we said, it's a perceived threat. Is it true? Is this in fact a threat? What's the anxiety telling you? What's the message of the emotion, right? So check it out. And it might be right and it might be wrong. Because here's the thing, emotions, the way we feel is true. We could validate that. But does that mean that it's accurate? Does that mean the message of the emotion is accurate? Absolutely not. It does not mean that. So check the facts means, hey, is this actually accurate? And very often, I'm going to, venture to say most of the time, it's simply not the case. I'll give one quick example. Let's just say, I was dealing with someone recently, and it's pretty common, anxious of coming late, or something like that. A person, they really rigid, they don't want to come late, they come home and, their spouse is not ready, or they're going to like a wedding or something, and, they're going to be late. Anxiety is in overdrive, fight, flight, right? Their body feels it, they're acting like it's a disaster. So if they can say, well, one second, my anxiety is saying that this is a threat, this is a disaster, let me check the facts of that. What is the threat? What actually is the threat? Okay. So the threat is that what? I'm going to come late, to the chasana. I'm going to come late to the wedding. Okay, so what? What's going to happen? Is anyone even going to notice? Maybe, maybe not. And even if they do, I'm going to miss pictures. Like, do I even really mind that? Not really. So once a person starts to bring in some of that, they realize that, even though the emotion is, and it's really tricking them, it's really the brain tricking and saying, hey, this is a threat, this is disaster, and that's why we have that fight-flight response, which, I don't really want to get into too much. Again, it's hard to get to everything, but basically a fight-flight means that your body is tricking you. It's pulling sort of that danger alarm that this is hard, this is a very, catastrophic situation, there is a real threat here, and really there's not. So all we have to do is to realize that and wait it out, and then to use something like check the facts, and very often we'll be able to realize that it's not as bad as we seemed, and we'll be able to do that. Okay, so those are all great cognitive techniques, and also some more emotional techniques. There's also another kind of anxiety, like anxious thoughts. Just in general, obsessive thoughts, if a person's thinking too much. And sometimes the thought is true, right? Sometimes a person's really worried about something that is factual. Let's say you're worried about something like, a bill that's due or something, or anything that's factual. So then we would use more what we call metacognitive techniques, which is not so much all the reframing. That's actually, more, techniques like having sort of acknowledging and identifying that you're engaging in a thought which is not helpful. It's not that it's not accurate, but it's not helpful. And then, there's actually techniques to veer away from that, decide not to engage in the thought, to use imagery, externalize the thought. So I feel like that's a little bit of a specific topic. Maybe we'll talk about it at a later point in time. But that's even if the thought is true, there still are techniques even to use for that. So just to summarize, because I do want to save time for any questions, if there are any. So step number one is identify how you feel. Pay attention if there's a specific reason why you're nervous or anxious. Usually is. If there is, is it factual? Try to reframe it. What's the evidence that this is true, right? The thought's predicting it's going to be a disaster. I can't deal with this. Has that ever happened? Probably not. Is it likely I will be able to deal with this? Probably yes. And even if it doesn't work out, is it going to be a disaster? Can I survive it? Usually yes. Okay, so a lot of that is super helpful as well. Try to problem solve it. Can I deal with this? Break it down. Focus on one thing at a time instead of being overwhelmed. All really, really good things. And we also discuss, check the facts of the emotion. And, sort of step number 2 is if it's really high or if it's unexplained emotion, use more of those other techniques, the emotion techniques, like as far as, changing your body's temperature, splashing your face with cold water and stuff like that. Or distract, which, by the way, distract can be anything. Distract can be literally, you can text someone, you could do anything sort of brainless, listen to music, play music. Again, but the idea of distract, it's short term, it's temporary, but it can really help you survive the moment. And of course, all of this is, to do in a mindful way and in a calm way. So those are all just, some ideas for how to deal with sort of the more general anxieties. I know there's a lot of questions as far as the more specific, so maybe just to bring up one super quick. So I know someone asked, what about dating? What about dating anxiety? Probably deserves a whole live by itself. It's a serious topic. I could totally hear why someone would be nervous from that one. But again, applying these sort of foundational pieces that we discussed. So think about it. Dating is just another example of all of this. So let's say if someone is nervous before a date, again, notice it in a mindful way, right? Very, very helpful. Say, and then what am I anxious about? Am I predicting, that it's not going to go well? Am I predicting that I'm not a good dater? All those kinds of things. And, how do I usually do on dates? Let me just do a quick glance over here and see if there's any questions. I'm sorry. All right, we'll check that afterwards. I don't want to distract. And so on and so forth. What am I scared of? And again, sometimes, of course, there are deeper things like, fear of marriage and so on and so forth. So yeah, and during the dates, for sure, not the best time for that, but a person would want to think about that beforehand. Sorry, it said pause due to poor connection. Sorry about that. And really just applying those same skills, of course, breathing and relaxation techniques and all those kind of things if a person is anxious. And then, during the date, if a person's anxious, same thing. It's, noticing the thought and like, hey, now's not really the time to deal with this, and then using those metacognitive techniques. But that's just one example. As far as I know, that question did come up, okay? I just want to figure out if I can check for if there's any questions over here. So please give me 1 second because I've never done this before. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm not sure. I don't want to make everyone wait. So I'm going to wind down from this one, all right? If there is, okay, I do see there is a question coming in now. Okay, so I'm just going to answer that one. So what's the difference between CBT and DBT? That's a great question. So it's actually more similar than you would think. In other words, CBT is a lot about thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So it's a wonderful thing. And again, there's a lot more. It gets deeper as far as what's a person's core beliefs, and often from childhood, has a lot going on. DBT is basically, just 30 seconds about it, does have a lot of cognitive, but really DBT was invented by and founded by Marsha Linehan. She's the founder of DBT, and she basically researched, as far as I know, every single form of therapy, and she came up with DBT. So it has a lot of really, really good stuff. She took everything she liked about every single therapy. That's why it does have a lot in it if you pay attention to DBT. But some of the main pieces which a lot of people use is they use a lot of the cognitive techniques. That is a big part of DBT, is the cognitive. Like, for instance, the checking the facts, the emotion regulation. I also mentioned the opposite emotion, the distress tolerance. So that's a lot of DBT. It also has the mindfulness. So mindfulness is a really, really big part of DBT as well, which is great. I love mindfulness. We use it tons. I would love to do a live just on mindfulness alone. I think it deserves its own topic. But basically, DBT to me it's CBT plus. It's sort of the cognitive plus more emotion regulation and mindfulness. It also has a module on interpersonal skills as well. So great question. Thank you for that. Okay, so that is pretty much everything. If there are any more questions or if I didn't see any of them, please feel free to follow up. I'll try to get to any of them, or any other requests to do any other lives or any other topics I'm very open to. Thanks so much for joining, and have a great night. He's trying to save it.